Good afternoon. On behalf of the Metals Service Center Institute and Optimum Safety Management, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled OSHA Compliance for the Metals Industry. In today's webinar, we're going to examine the top 10 most frequently cited violations in service centers and mills. During our webinar today, you may have questions, and we'd like this to be as interactive as possible and really to make sure that you get the information you're looking for to put the content of today's webinar into practice in your workplace and to have a great result and impact as a result of it. So we'd like you to take advantage of the Q&A section of the webinar panel. You'll find a section titled Questions, where you'll be able to go ahead and type in your question there, and that'll send that into the webinar center for us. So the goal is to get to about 45 minutes into the hour and have time available for some Q&A. And I would love to answer whatever questions you have at top of mind related to this subject. We would be remiss if we didn't begin with just a quick reminder of the fantastic content that's available for you as an operations and safety professional coming this September in Schaumburg, Illinois. We are going to be gathering again for the annual safety conference for the Metals Service Center Institute on September 25th and 26th. So please save the date for that and be aware of it as we are preparing as the MSCI Safety Council to provide you with some great content again this year. Just by way of introduction, your presenter for today is myself, Steve Yates, the founder and CEO of Optimum Safety Management. So we're a full-service safety consulting firm located in Lisle, Illinois, and working with a lot of the Metals Service Center Institute members, as well as companies in a number of different industries all across manufacturing and construction throughout North America. So we hope to bring you some expertise today that's very relevant and useful and also very current as we'll talk about some of OSHA's activity of late. As we talk about our topic today, I want to give you an outline for our content. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be talking about the top 10 most frequently cited in both service centers and mills, which we would consider to be the metals industry at large. The source for our data today is all found at OSHA.gov, data and statistics. It's actually through the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, BLS, at BLS.gov, but we're looking at the OSHA sections of their data. We're going to be looking at frequently cited OSHA standards. So for our neighbors to the north and south from both Canada and Mexico, we want to welcome you also as MSCI members to the webinar, and just apologize up front that we're going to be largely focused on OSHA standards today, but obviously these translate into your federal agencies for workplace safety, and you'll be seeing common industry issues as we walk through this. You'll just have to make the relevant transition to your standards. The data that we're looking at is representative of the time period from October of 2017 through September of 2018. This data has just become available to us, so you're getting hot off the press information from the North American or from the United States Department of Labor here in the webinar. The information that we're presenting, we're going to present it to you in 3 different verticals. We're going to be looking at what's happened within the NAICS, or North American Industry Classification System code for metal service centers. That's the metal and mineral merchant wholesalers, and as well in the mills, which is NAICS 331 for primary metal manufacturing. This does not cover metal fabricators, and I'll tell you why I'm bringing that up. Within the metal service center industry, there's a movement over the last probably 10 or so years to include more and more value-added services coming out of the service centers. So some light to, actually some of the service centers doing some very heavy plate fabrication and rolling, as well as additional services like machining and flame cutting and so on. So what we're going to be doing is the end slide, or one of the end slides in the presentation, end section, will cover fabricators. That's under NAICS 332. And I would encourage all of the operations and safety professionals that are working within the service center industry, if you have any value-add services, you really want to pay attention to those slides. It's the other fabricated metal product manufacturing. And we've pulled the top 10 citations for you there and really grouped that together for you well in a way that you'll be able to utilize that to eliminate some of the hazards within your workplace. We're also going to have, as we have this discussion of the top 10, we've provided you with a top 10 summary card for each of those groupings. And those are available within the webinar handout area. So within the webinar control, you'll find a handouts area. There are several different handouts there. One will be a copy of today's slides in a handout version. The other is the top 10 card for metal service centers. We're going to show you at the end of the webinar how you can also get those by visiting the Optimum website, and those will be available for you there as well for quick download, so you'll be able to utilize those. And those will be available not currently, but sometime this afternoon, so just check back with us a little bit later on in the day for those. The question is, how will you use this information? So what I'd like to do is just give a thought and a bit of a vision for today's webinar for those who are potentially very safety savvy and have been around the industry for a long time and really believe that you have a good handle on hazard awareness and control within your service centers. I know operating as a safety professional within an operating plant for many years, it was always good to have somebody walk through with a fresh set of eyes and also to give me their vision on things to look at and help me see within the service center or within the particular operating environment I was in. And no doubt the same for you. So what I'd like you to do today is to think about this from an evaluation standpoint of how your particular work environment is performing, and to utilize the resources we're providing as maybe a checklist or a thought prompt as you walk through the facility next time, or with your safety committees or safety teams that are doing inspections of the facility. Can really be useful. So let's make sure that we're not just here soaking up some information, but that we actually put it to use as we complete the webinar today and go back into the workplace. So with no further ado, let's dive right into the topic. We're going to talk about the top 10 most frequently cited OSHA standards. So the way we've formatted our slides for today is you'll see the section of the standard that's cited at the top. You'll see the ranking for service centers on the left, and then the ranking in mills on the right. We're also providing you with a little bit of background information. So as you see here, control of hazardous energy, or lockout tagout, has been cited this year in service centers as #1. You'll see that in 2017, it was also #1. However, in 2016, it was at number 15 in the rankings. So what this indicates to us is that over the last 2 years, OSHA has realized that metal service centers have a lot more than just steel and cranes where they're moving it and loading trucks, but that due to the amputation emphasis programs, OSHA is finding lockout issues at a high rate within the metal service centers. So you've seen it slide right up the scale into the #1 slot. Now, no surprise here in the mills, it's been at #1 over the last several years. So no changes indicated there. So that'll just give you an idea how to utilize that information and read it as we walk through the presentation. So the fact that control of hazardous energy is #1 is a total shocker, right? That's about as good as the jokes get, but we're trying to keep it a little light for you as we move through. Let's talk about some frequently cited issues, not only as we look at the OSHA standards, but from Optimum's experience as our safety professionals walk in and out of these facilities each day and work with many of the MSCI members on abating their OSHA problems as they might get cited. So the safety helpline frequently takes calls related to, hey, we just got cited by OSHA on this issue, and what we want to do is make sure that we're giving you the information on how to abate these problems. So first thing is OSHA will come in and cite on programmatic issues. They might come in and see that you have not developed your procedures yet for machine-specific lockout procedures. So we know that any piece of equipment that has more than one energy source, or that energy source is not readily identifiable, that we have to develop a procedure on how to put the piece of equipment into a zero energy state. So what we're watching here is that OSHA will find that we don't have those procedures, or maybe you've had an amputation and you had to report that. When OSHA comes in, they see that there's no developed procedure. The next thing they're going to look for after the procedure is they start diving in deeper. They want to know, do you have a lockout tagout program? And it's a very easy $7,000 to $13,000 item for OSHA to cite if you don't have a developed lockout program, or if the program is deficient in some way. So let's say that you have procedures and you have a program. They're going to look to the next step to see, have you done periodic inspections? Now, periodic inspections for lockout tagout will indicate things like, have you inspected the procedures annually? And have you, if you've done that, have you reevaluated your employees? Have you inspected them, your authorized employees, doing a lockout to make sure that they still have the requisite skill to be able to do lockout tagout as an authorized person and not end up injuring themselves or others? So if you have that, then they're going to look to see if you have general training. So training when it comes to lockout tagout will look like several different levels. Obviously, the first level is making sure that anybody doing lockout in your facility that's authorized has gone through a classroom training and had an initial authorization inspection to make sure they understand how to do lockout. However, in addition to that, anyone in your facility who is affected by your lockout tagout, maybe a machine operator who would not be involved in the lockout process, but needs to know if they walk up to the machine and it's disabled and there's locks, what is that about? Don't go and get a bolt cutter and cut the locks off and turn it on again. Somebody might be in the machine or whatever. That's called affected person. And then the other is other persons. So people that might not necessarily be in the plant all the time or affected by lockout, but might be in your HR department, or might be people in your sales department that do walkthroughs of the facility with customers. And you want them to be trained on what lockout is so that they, as an other person, understand it as well. Those are very easy to accomplish through toolbox talk training regimens and so on, but they do need to be done and documented so that OSHA can see proof of that training. And then specific enforcement of procedures is also important. And we want to make sure that you have good documentation of disciplinary action if procedures are not being followed. So make sure that all those are in place, and also that any of your supervisors who might be supervising employees who are doing lockout tagout, they should be trained at the authorized person level to make sure they understand what their employees are required to do and what it should look like in the event of a lockout tagout. Then we're going to move on to our second most frequently cited in service centers. This would be machine guarding. Now, this takes on a lot of different aspects within the OSHA standards, and you'll see that there are 5 different sections of the 1910 standard that are quoted at the top. You'll see this has slid up from number 3 last year. It's maintained at number 3 in the mills again, but it relates to general machine guarding, you got to remember that we need to guard physical hazards, such as rotating parts and laceration hazards and so on. But also, we've got to think about chemical hazards, splashing, things that could blow out of a valve that might hit an employee, as well as thermal energy or heat sources. Any component that's at 140 degrees or higher can be considered to be an instant burn hazard, and that needs to be guarded. Point of operation, where the equipment does the operation, such as a shear where it shears the metal. Power transmission components, rotating drive shafts or couplings that might have a set screw sticking out or anything like that. All of that needs to be covered and guarded. Anywhere you have a shaft that protrudes beyond a bearing and that type of thing, those all need to be guarded. Bench grinders. This is like an OSHA inspector walking into a candy store. Every plant that we walk into, we see bench grinders that have either missing tongue guards or work rests, or that they're improperly adjusted or guarded. So make sure that all of that equipment is in place and proper. There are resources to determine proper guarding and so on. Feel free to call the safety helpline. We can help you with those things as well. Number 3, wiring methods, equipment, safeguards, or practices, anything found within the electrical section of the OSHA standards. You'll see this did not move in 2017. In mills, it actually climbed from number 9 up into the number 6 slot. You'll see some pictures that we've taken within different service centers or fabricating environments over on the right side. Obviously, that's a violation. Open cabinets, guards and covers missing where there's live conductors. So OSHA is frequently citing for proper installation and use, making sure that devices that were designed to be mounted are not connected to the end of a piece of long cord and laid on the floor as an extension cable. We need to make sure it's all properly mounted. Grounding needs to be permanent and effective. So if you have forklifts running into electrical conduit and disconnecting the EMT or electrometallic tubing, that EMT tubing carries your ground path from outlet to outlet unless you have a grounding wire. So if those are disconnected, that's a cause for your ground path not being there. You can start fires or create significant shock hazards and electrocution hazards. Flexible cords we see very often used in fixed and permanent conditions. We know that because they're wire tied to the structure of the building, and that indicates that they're now not temporary but being used permanent. Strain relief on your extension cords where the insulating jacket is pulled free from the plug. Pull boxes and junction box covers missing, or knockout plugs that are missing where someone has created opened up a knockout hole and left the conductors exposed because there's no plug cover in there, no cover. Safeguards and practices all found within NFPA 70E get cited under this section of the standards, and there's a lot there for electrical safe work practice training, insulated tools and equipment, including PPE for gloves and glove covers and inspection of those gloves. So make sure that all of your practices like that are being evaluated on a consistent basis. When we get into number 4 now for service centers, you'll see this dropped from just number 2 last year down to number 4, and then it's dropped also in the mills. So powered industrial trucks, we see a lot of competency training issues where operators are not trained or the documentation's not kept or proper. Refresher training is not done. Refresher training is not done at a 3-year interval, or post-incident would be a good time to do some refresher training and document that. Not keeping certification of training, or forklifts not being kept in a safe operating condition. Make sure that we're examining them for defects. What I mean there is pre-shift inspections. So if you run a 3-shift operation, how many inspections do you need to do? That would be 3, right? Got to do one of those at the beginning of each and every shift. So make sure all that's in place, but also documented, okay? And also, I would just want to remind everybody to, if you have questions, go ahead and continue to submit those questions into the Q&A section of the webinar. We do want to address those, and we want to make sure we get them covered for you. We get into number 5 here in service centers. This would be respiratory protection. It's actually moved up from number 9. This would be something that is not very common in service centers unless you're doing things like painting or maybe some blasting or some other operations that would require it. But we're seeing for some reason it's come up, so that indicates that more service centers are using it than OSHA thought, and they're now going to go ahead and continue to issue citations. We see here that it's moved up in the mills as well to number 2. So when we look at the frequently cited issues here, there's a lot to running an effective respiratory protection program. So medical evaluation of the employees, having a written program, making sure you're performing all the proper training, and then obviously fit testing the employees, properly storing. We see issues with this in almost every environment where people are using respirators. They're not properly storing them to keep them clean between use. And then also the proper selection. So we see quite often companies giving the wrong respirator cartridges to their employees. So make sure you're properly selecting those. Your PPE vendors can use those, can help you with that, as well as the safety helpline or companies like Optimum. There's a lot of resources, the manufacturer for the respirator. So the information is readily available, just making sure you're taking advantage of that, properly protecting your employees and so on. All right, here we go. Let's take a look at the number 6 citation now for walking working surface in service centers. This is up from number 10, and that's not surprising. OSHA rewrote this standard in November of, losing track of time now, November of 17, and really expanded the standard. So they've got a lot more to cite and a lot more specifics to cite with. You'll see it also moved up in the mills. So lots to look at here. Make sure you're taking a look at this standard and working through all the different issues related to it. Frequently cited, though, is any platform 4 feet or more in height needs to have a rail, a tow board, anytime you have personnel exposure below it, or an opportunity for things to be kicked off of it and into equipment, or any moving machinery below it. Safety requirements for scaffolds and ladders, they're all now very similar to construction. They brought those into alignment together. And then obviously within the mills, you have a lot of additional platforms and pits that you're accessing and different things like that. So much more need to be more detailed, including fixed stairwells, fixed ladders, portable ladders. There's a lot of different components there. So please do make sure that you're becoming the expert on things related to the walking working surface standard. I'm not even going to broach the topic here of fall protection when on trailers. That is the wild, wild west of fall protection and safety. That's a topic that gets addressed frequently at our safety conferences. If you have specific issues to that, we'd love to entertain those at the safety helpline. Feel free to give us a call and give us a challenge. Those are always very challenging topics to solve. So moving on now to the number 7 in metal service centers. This is a new one now to hit the top 10 for service centers. And it relates to fuel gas use, oxy fuel gas, any fuel gas type usage, as well as cutting tables, burning tables, beveling stations. There's a lot of use for an oxy fuel torch within a metal service center, and OSHA is realizing that, obviously, and starting to really bring this into the forefront. So a lot of common issues we see here relate to cylinder storage. We tried to give you just a quick recap here verbally of some of the issues. So making sure your cylinders are upright secured, capped, that we're separating oxygen from fuel gas, that you don't have too much of it in the building. The OSHA standards are actually pretty descriptive here, and they give you the amounts of gases you can have and the separation distances and all that. Flashback arresters, you do need these on cart setups as well as manifolds and piping systems. We frequently see issues on this. I would say probably 90% of the service centers, when we begin working with them, we find issues related to the way they're storing cylinders, as well as to how they're using or not using flashback arresters. Poorly repaired hoses. Again, this is a very, very big issue within the service center industry. We find people that repair their own hoses and don't follow the instructions within the repair system that they buy. Or, as we've dug into this a couple times, I've actually found that the repair systems don't show you all of the details on what you need to do to properly repair it. So we find people that lose the crimping tools, they use vice grips and create leaking hoses. Nobody in the industry that I've come across yet, without telling them that they need to do it, is burst testing their hoses. There's a Compressed Gas Association pamphlet referenced on the right side. It can be found in the OSHA standards. It talks about burst testing your hoses to 350 pounds of pressure after repair. And I can tell you the funny looks I get when I tell people that. They don't believe me, and it's there in the standards. Utilization of hose clamps. They loosen up and create leaks, so be careful with that. And then everywhere that we go, we see training deficiencies on the use of torches. Make sure also, if you're using piping systems, there are testing requirements on those for leaks and inspection of welds and deterioration of the piping. You don't want those gases getting out of the pipe for obvious reasons. We use them because they accelerate burning or that they're very flammable. So let's make sure we keep them in the pipe. Moving on to occupational noise exposure, number 8 in the service centers here. This has come onto the grid because we didn't have any exposures that were cited in 17 and very little in 16. It's at number 9 in the mills, has dropped a little bit. That tells us either the mills are doing better or OSHA's focused otherwhere. That's not probably good English. OSHA's focused in other places. So frequently cited issues here is that we don't have a hearing conservation program with exposures over 85 decibels. There's no monitoring program in place to check what it is, no audiometric testing program for baselines or annual retest, and no training for how to use hearing plugs for hearing protection properly. So make sure you have all that in place if you have any thoughts that you have exposures to noise. OSHA record keeping. We've seen OSHA cite this in several sections here, and it's about the same for the service centers, moved from 8 to 9. It was not cited frequently at all within the mills last year. What we see here is either record keeping not kept, under or over reporting. Be careful with over reporting. It'll put you on their hit list for high hazard industry and cause you to have citation or inspections on targeting lists. Companies not keeping a summary log or it's not being posted. Typically this is cited as an other than serious, but remember now you have a duty to report and make sure that you're reporting any of your what used to be considered catastrophic injuries, and there's more information on that. Let us know if you have a question there. We'd love to answer them. Moving on, we're at number 10 now in service centers. This is overhead and gantry cranes. So frequently cited here, used to be at the number 4, now down at the number 10 level, and was not cited frequently within the mills last year. That tells us that they take care of their crane issues. But safe operating condition can be cited. Examination for defects, things like inspection, making sure you're inspecting each shift with your operator, monthly with qualified internal staff annually with third-party inspectors that are documenting those inspections. All of these inspections, by the way, should be documented. And remember to watch for duty rating on your crane. If your crane is used beyond its standard duty rating, these inspection frequencies need to be increased. So if you're using it for more lifts than the crane is designed, it'll create a duty rating higher, and your manufacturer instruction will tell you how much more frequently to inspect that crane. Please make sure you're cognizant of that. Rigging issues are cited at 1910.184, and I think we've got a slide on that coming up later in the presentation. In fact, I'm sure we do. General duty paragraph gets cited number 11, so we're trying to make sure that we give you a little bit more than just your top 10, and the way that we group these, we'll group common issues together. So you might look at somebody else's grouping for your industry and see a little bit of a difference, but we group all of our electrical together, we group all of our rigging issues together and so on to try and get you an easier to look at graph and incorporate more hazards. So here we're seeing frequently cited issues being magnetic restarts on cutting machinery. So we want to make sure that when you re-energize a piece of equipment by utilizing its disconnect, that you don't automatically restart the equipment. There should be a start button, and that has to be held or activated in order to restart the equipment. So just make sure that your equipment functions that way, or you might have a magnetic restart in the process that's creating an issue. We've seen OSHA cite this in the industry. Also be cognizant of codes outside of the OSHA regulations, such as ANSI. So the ANSI B11 standard is a big one for machine guarding. We want to make sure that you're aware of that. If you've got specialty equipment in your facility, like roundo shape benders or cambering machines and other specific equipment for metalworking, they all fall under an ANSI standard. You should be aware of it. You should have somebody come in that's qualified to evaluate the equipment and make sure that they are doing a good job of protecting your interests and your employees there. So I'm going to move on. Again, more information available on any of these topics by calling the helpline or looking at OSHA's website. There's tons of information in the industry, so avail yourself of that. Lead and chromium VI, what is that? That's known as hex chrome or hexavalent chromium. We're seeing this now pop up in the mills as number 4. It was number 7 last year for lead and chromium issues. So make sure that if you're in a service center, you don't just check the box and say, well, this doesn't apply to me. If you are cutting or welding on any stainless steel, hexavalent chromium should be evaluated within your service center. Frequently cited issues relate to exposure monitoring, knowing what's going on in your facility, checking the air, and so on. Written plans, no PPE, etc. You can see the exposures here. Moving on to slings, this is number 13 in service centers, but such a big issue, we wanted to make sure that you are aware of it because it can be very deadly. What you're looking at in the photo there is a job site that we were on in 2007 with a brand new piece of rigging. They put it under load on the job site, and as the operator was coming up on it, the fitting had not been swayed or compressed. And what happened is that rigging, the fitting fell down the rigging, and it showed itself to not be complete. Thankfully, they stopped it before they got it in the air. If that had lasted while they hoisted the load over somebody or over a piece of equipment, it could have been deadly. So we want to make sure that you're looking for damaged and broken, no labels and tags, no daily inspections, documented inspections of chain at least annually. So make sure you're following your rigging protocols. Hazard communications, again, this is not cited frequently in the service centers this year. But last year it was at number 5. It's number 7 in the mills. It's a big deal. Let's make sure that we're looking at our chemical communication process, hazard communication, right to know, global harmonization standard, however you refer to it, making sure that you have these things taken care of. And then permit required confined space, obviously a big deal in the mills, right? Lots of confined spaces. It's at a number 10 here in the mills. It is not I don't think I've ever seen it show up in the service centers. However, in service centers, we have confined spaces, machine pits and bases under rolling machines and large brake presses and makeup air units. And there's a lot of different things there that might trigger a confined space exposure. So please make sure that you're looking through and thinking about confined space inventory within every facility. We should always have a confined space inventory. If it says none, that's perfect, as long as it's accurate. But make sure you're doing a confined space inventory for your facility, making sure you have none. Otherwise, you've got a lot of exposure, and so do your employees. And remember, as we're talking through these things, we want to make sure that we're not just thinking about the OSHA citation. The reason there's an OSHA standard for it is because somebody got injured, right? You'll hear people say the OSHA standards are written in blood, and they're absolutely right. I want to make sure that we're taking care of these issues so we drive the not only the citation out, but the hazard out of the workplace. General requirements for PPE. This did not get cited again this year frequently in service centers, and was number 3 last year in the mills, but didn't appear on the list. I don't want you to forget about it, so we've put it up here. Make sure that you're covering these issues. So certifying that you have a hazard assessment and so on, making sure you have the proper PPE. Very, very important that your employees are trained on the exposure and why they need it, as well as how to use it, and that it's properly maintained, clean, and in the case of things like electrical safe work practice, where you have electrical hazard gloves or electrical safety gloves, making sure that those are annually inspected, or at least annually inspected. Here we are with means of egress. This showed up as number 13 in the service centers this year. It was number 10 last year, climbed a little bit in the mills, but obviously the picture on the right, totally inappropriate. Got to make sure people can get out of your building. I know some of the facilities in the industry are in very poor areas where we might have a higher crime rate and that type of thing. Make sure that we're not locking exit doors so that people can't get out of the building. I have seen that in facilities, and it's very dangerous. Making sure we have proper exit routes and so on. Okay, moving on to portable fire extinguishers. This didn't show up in either industry at all on the frequently cited list. It's a big deal, so we want, again, just wanted to make sure that you're thinking about it, making sure that your people have the proper training to be able to use the equipment if you're requiring that it's properly inspected, and so on. All right, moving off of that slide. So, I'm going to take a breath for a minute, take a quick drink. And we're going to talk now about value-added services. And I got to tell you, I love this part of our industry. It's such a neat thing to see all of the different equipment that's come into the industry and being used. However, it brings a lot of hazards with it. So we've gone to the fabricated metals product manufacturing area to give you a top 10 here for what companies that are doing value-added might be exposed to. So we're going to utilize the same top 10 lists for the metal service center, but we want you to add these items. The portable fire extinguishers we've already talked about. We want you to give consideration to spray finishing using any flammable and combustible materials. It was cited number 10 for fabricators. That's because of the use of primers and paint coatings and so on within the industry. Remember, if you're using those, you also have potential exposures to toxicity for your employees, as well as PPE exposures. So lots of different things to consider. Good job hazard analysis in every one of these industries is critical, but making sure that we're really paying attention to it when we start entering the area where we have toxic chemicals. Lead, if you have hazard exposure there, based on the materials you might be cutting, welding, forming, and then obviously the oxy-fuel gas welding and cutting exposures that we talked about earlier. Also watch metal fume. So you have to think about this with when we're doing any flame cutting, any cutting tables. Make sure you have good exhaust hoods or good exhaust in your building, and that flame tip exposure is proper. As far as tip sizes, that we're not adjusting the torch tips improperly to have a lot of excess fume coming and excess exposure to toxicity coming off of that cutting operation. Making sure that that's being evacuated out of the building. We see large plumes of smoke and clouds hanging at the top of the building. The employees are all exposed to that. You need to make sure you're evacuating it from the building. Putting just the table operator in a respirator is not adequate. And then also, like I mentioned earlier, hexavalent chromium issues for stainless steel exposures. All right, OSHA incidence rate trends. Let's talk about some of the trending now within the industry. And we're going to move through some of this fairly quickly, but I want to alert everybody to this USDL report, to the U.S. Department of Labor report that's available at BLS.gov. And it's the numbers given right there, USDL 1788. You can go and search for that right at BLS.gov. And what you're going to find is this very long report. We just wanted to pull the one graph up in front of you and show you that across all industries, across the United States, and I'm assuming that this is going to flow into Canada and Mexico as well, industry rates are dropping. What that means is that the industry is getting better at recognizing its issues and driving them out of the industry. So let's take a look at our industry. The question for us is, within our workplace, are we doing the same? So here within the metals industry, metal service centers, you can see that the BLS data for total recordable incident rates dropped from 5 down to 4.5 in the last year, the last reporting year. So that's a nice drop, right? So we're seeing that the industry is getting better. This is good. This is a good downward trend. We see the same within the DART rate, the days away restricted or transferred rate. That's coming down. We also see the same within the lost time injury rate. That means we're not injuring people at the same rate where they can't come back to work. That's awesome, right, to see these drops. We see the same thing here, the same trending within the mills. Those rates are dropping. So I want to give the industry a big pat on the back, right? And just say, look, great job as an industry. We're driving the rates down. That's really great. Here at Optimum, our vision is to see workers everywhere valued and safe. So this really aligns with our vision as well. We're glad to be, part of helping to influence the industry, even if at just a small level. But great job, right? Now here's the issue, though. Within your workplace, how are you stacking up? And is 4.4 or 4.5 acceptable? So when we take a look at leadership, right, we look at John Maxwell here at Optimum. We're big followers of John's writings and trying to really help people understand how to utilize his leadership laws within the workplace. One of the things he teaches in the 21 irrefutable laws of leadership is the law of navigation. Take people on a journey with you to a better place. So what's the better place? It's got to be a compelling vision, right? Industry average, really, folks, it just ain't all that compelling. When we look at total recordable industry rates at BLS.gov for service centers, it's 4.5. So what does that mean? So while I'm giving us a big pat on the back, I want to call us to a better place. 4.5 means we're still injuring 4.5 people out of every 100 people that come into your workplace. Do you have 200 total? That means that 9 of them, if you're average, are going to get injured this year. You got 300? That number's up to 18. Hopefully I'm making my point that when we look at what these numbers mean, It's not just some arbitrary index. This is people like you and I being injured like you and I don't want to be injured. We have to set a better vision for what that better place looks like. So really what we want to do is we want to measure and evaluate against our own performance each year. So the industry's at 4.5, not good. If you're at a 2.0, what are you doing to move that to a 1.8 or a 1.5 next year? What are you doing to move it closer to 0 each and every year and driving it out? And if you're higher than 4.5, you know, I don't want to be the one to like give you a bad day here, but if you're over 4.5, it ain't good. We got to get better, right? So how do we get better? Well, here's another thing John tells us. Everything rises and falls on leadership. It all relates to the person in the mirror that you can see when you stand in front of it each morning. It relates to you. So you got to get better. Your leadership at your business has to get better personally and for those above you, and you need to be teaching those below you. So I just want to tap you on the shoulder and say, today's the day. Time to get serious about leadership. So at Optimum, we've given some resources that you can really utilize to help you be better at leadership. So what you're going to find if you go to our website at OSHAsafetymanagement.com, and I'm not selling you something here, so those that are tuning me out right now and think this is the sales pitch, stop it. There's no charge for any of this. I want you to use it. We spent a lot of money to put this together and a lot of time, and I want to give it to you because it's having an impact across the industry, and we want it to impact you and the rest of your people. So please go take advantage of it. All 21 of John's laws are recorded into a 1.5-minute video within a safety context. So order the book for the people on your safety committees. It's available in Spanish as well as several other languages. Make sure people are reading it. Use it in your leadership teams. Your top 20% of your organization, they all should be reading this book. Every one of them, without a doubt, all the way up to the CEO. And they should be watching the videos and talking about this context of safety leadership within your workplace. So please take advantage of those resources. Okay, so OSHAsafetymanagement.com or OptimumSafetyManagement.com/vlogs. For the older ones in the crowd like me, that's video blogs. So vlogs. And go ahead and sign up for those. It'll send you the first one and it'll show you how to get the rest. And we'd love to hear stories back on how you're using them in your workplace to make it better. All right, let's move into a time of Q&A. And we've got several questions that have been submitted by the attendees here. I'm going to address one real quick at the top of the list. And it was, what was the number 2? And I think that relates to a question on mills. So what you've seen as we've gone through is I've been showing you in an order 1 through 10 for the service centers. And on the right, the mills are out of order. So we've covered for sure 1 through 10 in the mills. We've just not done it in the right order. We've used the service centers to drive the order of the slides. And you'll see on the slide here right now on the right, it has the OSHA Top 10 card for metal service centers. You'll be able to download the one for mills and fabricators, and they'll be in your order, and you can use those as you'd like. All right, let's talk about a question that came in. So how does OSHA view modification of forks for powered industrial trucks? For example, if you drill a hole in the fork to secure things like bins, or I'll tell you where else I've seen this used is for people to put a ball hitch on it to tow compressors around their yard. OSHA doesn't like you doing that. That's the short answer. So any piece of lifting gear, like a lifting beam, a forklift, a crane, any piece of rigging, it's all rated as it was originally designed. So if you drill a hole in it, you're going to weaken that tip because you've removed some of the section of the metal. If you burn a hole in it with a torch, I've seen this done a lot actually, you flame cut a hole in it. What happens is you carburize the steel right around it. You draw the carbon into that area, and the thin sections to either side can become brittle. And as you pick something up, it can actually break and drop that tip right off and drop the load that you have. So no modifications. Now, if you need a hole in the tip of your fork, there's attachments you can attach to the fork to do things like what I just described. And they're designed, and they'll tell you what the weight ratings are, et cetera. And in addition to that, you can order forks with a hole in the tip already, and then the manufacturer would be giving you the rating as it's configured. So that's an adequate way to do that. Okay. All right. Let's take a next question. I had a question come up here. The person said, never mind, but you know what? I think I'm going to address it because it's probably in somebody else's mind. With regard to walking and working surface, what about scissor lifts and flatbeds? And then I think I probably addressed the flatbed issue, so that took it away. But let's talk about scissor lift for a minute. Just make sure you're following the manufacturer's recommendations. Make sure that if the manufacturer says to tie off in it, that you tie off. If they don't, the OSHA standards still don't call out tie off in scissor lift, but they certainly do in a telescopic boom lift. So let's make sure that we're following that. And all of those devices should have proper training for the operator. Remember that the training that the rental company gives you when they drop it off is called familiarization. That is not operator training. Classroom sitting with a test at the end and then a road test, that's operator training. So don't shortcut it. It won't hold up, and your operators need to be more aware than that. Okay, so a question came up, do I sell the 21 Laws books? Or they probably are wondering also, do I get a kickback, or am I just promoting a book you really believe in? I'm going to tell you that we don't sell it. I don't get a kickback. I read the 21 Laws of Irrefutable Leadership 23 or 24 years ago and began following the principles then, saw them in practice and how they really apply to life, leadership, business, workplace, etc., and just really believe in them. And the feedback that we've gotten from people that have begun reading it is that not only is it changing their attitude at work and things in the workplace, but it's also changing their attitude at home and their families. I had one guy tell me after 1 week, his wife picked it up before he got it and started reading it to the kids, and the whole family's reading it now. And got to tell you, that just really makes me feel good that we put a resource like that into their hands that could actually impact their family. So take all this stuff home, right? Use it there. Play the videos at home on Friday nights. Anyway, moving on. I see the session is being recorded. Will it be available for future use? The answer is yes, it is available. Give them a few days to get it up there, but it does get uploaded into the members section at the MSCI website, and you'll be able to retrieve it there. I do have one other question that got called in, and that is, we're cutting stainless steel, so we might have an exposure to hex chrome. How would we know, and where do we begin? And so I covered this kind of briefly in the webinar, so it just gives me an opportunity to speak to it a little bit more in detail. So anytime you have an exposure, and I'll just speak kind of categorically to any contaminant, somebody's spraying something, you're blasting something, whatever it is, there's some mist or fumes in the workplace. The only way to really tell if you have an exposure is to do what we would call industrial hygiene sampling or monitoring. So that would involve the use of an industrial hygienist typically. This is a good place to utilize your workers' compensation loss control services. They can sometimes come in and do this for you at a really cost-effective fashion. If you don't have access to services like that, there's third parties like Optimum and others that can come in and do it. What would happen is you'd have to build a protocol for making sure you're using the right sampling method and media. You need to collect it properly on the right media, and then it's got to go off to a lab. And when it reaches the lab will do an analysis on those samples and give you a report back that's typically pretty scientific. And the results would then be analyzed by that industrial hygienist and tell you if you have an exposure. A couple of things I like to educate buyers on this type of service too. Let's make sure that we're following recommended practices by the ACGIH. So who is that? The American Council on Governmental Industrial Hygienists. And you'll find that council recommends a 25% sampling level. So if you have 50 employees that are exposed to the same contaminants at the same shift, you want to make sure you're sampling 25% of them. So that would be like 13 of them, right? 12 and a half, got to go to 13. If you have 4 people, you want to make sure you sample 1. Probably should do a second in case you lose a sample. So don't just hire somebody to come in and sample only 1 person. You're just going to end up with a problem if the sampling pump goes down and you'll have to resample. So anyway, there's a lot that goes into that. Let me move on and take another question here real quick. Do you recommend that we test for silica if we have a machine such as a water jet that uses garnet sand with water as the cutting agent? Man, that's a great question, right? So when we have an exposure, we want to use engineering controls first, then administrative, and then PPE. So your engineering control for this process would be water. Typically, you want to validate that your engineering control is working. So if you have any reason to believe that engineering control is not working, it would be a great idea to validate it and have somebody come in and sample. I would have to tell you, best practice would say sample once and see. If you're under the exposure or you have no exposure, follow the silica standard, and it'll give you the information on that to be able to then not have to sample in the future. You probably do want to make sure all that's documented properly. And I'm actually seeing, we have one of our gentlemen, one of our safety pros on the line today on the webinar, Mike Hartnett. Mike actually is an expert on the silica standard and would be available at our safety helpline. He'd probably love to have a further conversation with you on that, because I might have just butchered some of that. I'm not the expert here on the silica standard, so I'm speaking in general terms. So the person who dropped that question, if you want to give our helpline a call, I'm actually going to put that number up right now, and you can feel free to call that helpline at any time. And the hours are there, the helpline number's there. You can also drop an email at safetyhelpline@optimum-usa.com. And Mike could be the one to field that question. He can get you some great info. So at this point, we're going to close the Q&A and move on to just talking about the safety helpline. So I've mentioned it a few times. This is a free member benefit exclusive to Metal Service Center Institute members, and we want to offer that. It gets underutilized, so please take advantage of it. We love answering questions on safety here. As you can tell, we love talking about safety constantly. It's what we do, and there is no fee for inquiries through that helpline. So please take advantage of it. In the event that there is something you need researched, or we'd have to come out to a facility, obviously that might require a fee, but that's something we'd let you know about before anything like that would happen. So feel free to go ahead and use that information, and it's also in your webinar slide handouts. So again, I want to thank everybody for participating in today's webinar. We're going to be respectful of your time and right on time here today. Again, we're just very grateful of our membership with MSCI, puts us in touch with a lot of great professionals in the industry. We're thankful to be able to work with you on the Safety and Health Council, as well as within the safety conference, and then also with all of the different members here and getting into relationship with you and your CEOs as we visit the annual conference and all the different events where we're displaying the safety helpline throughout the year. So again, thanks for the relationship. Thanks for being here with us today. Hope this has been useful for you, and we really look forward to being of value to you in the future. I'm going to leave the interface open for a little bit for people to download, and I believe as soon as we end the webinar, you'll see a questionnaire. We would love to have you fill in that questionnaire. Monique Combs at the MSCI has posted a few questions in there for you, and it will ask you about future topics, what you'd like to see. We plan these out a year in advance, and we do have topics, but we're open to changing them. If there's a rising tide in the industry where somebody has a need and there's a number of people, I'll tell you one that we've been talking about putting a webinar together titled Understanding Safety for the HR Professional. And I just want to pose that question, and would you give me some feedback? If you're a HR professional who's been tasked to run or lead or manage safety, would you give us feedback on whether that'd be valuable to you or not, please? And again, thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and close the webinar at this point, and really appreciate your attendance. Have a great and safe day.